Hello Jan, thanks for being with us today.
Pleasure.
You are from Europol, and we would be interested in what is, in your opinion, the challenge of law enforcement in the digital age?
That's a good one. So first of all, thank you very much for the interview. My name is Ellermann. I'm a senior specialist in Europol's data protection function. And if from my particular perspective, let's say one challenge definitely is that in the digital age, the volumes of personal data law enforcement has to deal with are ever increasing. So that, of course, then triggers technical challenges, but also data protection related challenges, because you need to contextualize that information. You want to prevent mass surveillance. And here, we have a job to do. On the one hand, we want to make Europe a safer place, but we also have a mission and a commitment to do that in a way which respects fundamental rights, in particular the right to data protection in the Europol context. And this is sometimes not an easy job, but always an interesting job. And I think opportunities such as CPDP, where we are at the moment, where I get a chance to meet people like you, NGOs, activists, and a lot of people who have a lot of expert knowledge on data protection, that's really an opportunity sometimes also to get a different perspective, a critical perspective. All of that ultimately helps very much to get the job right.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you mentioned mass surveillance. That is kind of a keyword that also the European data protection supervisor brought into press by criticizing the way data was stored at Europol. Can you comment on that, please?
Yes, of course. So Europol's big data challenge is a saga in the meantime. So it started quite a long time ago, namely in April 2019. When our executive director proactively approached the European data protection supervisor seeking guidance on the dilemma that we keep receiving rather huge amounts of data, and she wanted to be sure that how we do that is fine. That resulted in scrutiny by the EDPS, and we got what was called an admonishment. So that was something like a slap with a hand on our fingers to say, this is not how we think you should be doing it. But at the same time, there was a huge expression of trust from the supervisor to say, you are in the best position to tackle that challenge, and this is what we did. So there was an action plan afterwards, resulting in 5 concrete actions in order to improve the situation, which was also welcomed by the data protection supervisor. There was one question which remained controversial between the organization and its external data protection supervisory authority, and that was how long can you retain data regarding which you are not sure what the personal implication is. So we talk about data subject categorization here. So in the Europol legal framework, there's a requirement to say Europol must only process personal data relating to suspects, convicted persons, what we call potential future criminals. Now, may sound to you a bit like Minority Report, but that's a rather common thing also in national criminal procedural law. It means individuals for whom there are factual indications or reasonable grounds to believe they will commit a criminal offense within Europol's mandate. And then you have a few other categories such as contacts, associates, witnesses, and informants. But the thing is, if, let's say, imagine you would be a terrorist and we seize your iPhone. If you open your iPhone, and I'm just looking together with you now at my phone, and you browse through pictures on your phone, it won't take long and you will have pictures such as this one here. So that shows my son. You can see here. I shouldn't show him publicly maybe. But then what is interesting is in the very background of the picture, there's also another guy. I've never met him. I have no single clue who he is. But if this phone is seized, rightfully, because I'm a terrorist, and is forensically examined, that picture will become part of the data processing operation. And that guy here in the background, where none of us knows who he is, that is still personal data we are processing about that individual.
For sure.
And this is a legal dilemma which we are confronted with. You can scale it, of course. So the big data challenge is not just about ever-increasing volumes, but it was also about a legal framework which in the case of Europol said, it's these categories and it must never be anything else. And that didn't work in practice.
Yeah, I see.
And I'm glad to see that also the legislator ultimately understood that. So as of July, we're going to have a new legal framework, and this new legal framework is a bit more forthcoming as regards the operational needs. So there will be provisions acknowledging that subject to certain safeguards, you may also process personal data where you don't know for sure who's this guy in the background. That's a silly example, of course, but I think it illustrates the underlying dilemma quite nicely.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Maybe another question. Europol is, of course, like in the center of collaboration between also European national police agencies. What are the challenges? Figuring that each state has different legislations, different technologies, different data processing capabilities.
Yeah.
How does it work?
Well, the good news is, at least as far as the European Union is concerned, the legislative frameworks for data processing should not be that different, because we have the Law Enforcement Directive. As you know, a directive still leaves room for national proceedings, which indeed can differ then from one another. But we have a level playing field. However, also in law enforcement, sometimes you have the need not only to collaborate across Europe, but globally. So this is where things can become more tricky, because in the let's say civil world, you are very much aware of Schrems 1 and 2. And we have the same principles, of course, also in the law enforcement world. And ultimately, that means that under normal circumstances, you're only supposed to exchange personal data if there's an adequate level of data protection on the side of the recipient. And if you take into account, let's say, the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice, equivalent or an adequate level of safeguard essentially means you need an equivalent level.
Yeah.
And that is sometimes, when you talk about law enforcement, when you try to prevent and fight terrorism, for instance, you also sometimes have to collaborate with partners where, in all honesty, we don't live up to European standards in every sense. But then you still need a certain level of flexibility to maybe provide for safeguards, which then still make it work. So these are areas where it can become very tricky in terms of collaboration. Another area I would like to touch upon, because I know you guys are also very busy in that domain, is then research and innovation. So technology, how can digitalization help law enforcement to do the job better? And here you can see that in our new legal framework, we will have an explicit legal basis also to use personal data for the purpose of research and innovation. And then, of course, you can say this is where AI, machine learning, and all these tricky things come into play. That's acknowledged. This is why the legislator, let's say, put a very robust framework around it. So for every R&I project which we support, such as I know you're involved in Infinity, for instance, there are a number of others which Europol is involved in, like GRACE, for instance, on combating sexual exploitation of children. In those contexts, we also need to apply machine learning in order to order and, let's say, pre-cluster the big volumes of data we are confronted with. And what the legislator said here in principle is that is okay, you get a legal basis to do it, but there are also safeguards such as you need to define the specific purpose of a project, you need to do a data protection impact assessment. Not only will you have to involve the data protection officer of Europol, but there will also be a new function called fundamental rights officer.
Okay.
Taking into account that what Europol does, we don't have coercive powers. So, of course, the main fundamental right concerned for everything we are doing is the right to data protection. But the legislator said also, okay, fair enough. But if you submit your reports into the field and across the world, there can be very tangible consequences for individuals. So somebody might be thrown into prison even though that person is innocent. So then we're not just talking about the right to data protection, but there are other very important fundamental rights concerned. And this is why there will be a new function, a new position within our organization to also focus on things from that angle, which I welcome as a further, let's say, improvement of checks and balances, if you want.
Thank you, Jan. That was really insightful. Thank you very much and have a great conference.
Thank you very much, and you too. It was a pleasure talking to you.